Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are speaking about our study of each of the poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. Now we turn to Song of Myself, passage 15, one of the longer sections of Song of Myself, along with passage 33, and I think one of the more misunderstood passages of Song of Myself. In fact, from the very beginning, there was always this question about, dude, what's going on with all this listing stuff? Now, to put this study in some kind of context, remember, we've said already in earlier lectures, which I hope you've been following of our stuff at learnstrong.net, the Talks with Walt playlist. We, of course, have covered all 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections of starting from Pomanak. We'll reference a number of those poems here in this study. And then, of course, Song of Myself up through passage 14. But remember that we said in earlier lectures that section 8 through 16, obviously at 15 now, we're coming to the end of this catalog section. Now, what exactly is it that's going on? Well, I'll try and give you a couple of things I think's happening, okay? One of those, I think I've already worked with you in passage 4, that both in and out of the game, watching and wondering at it. I think, as I have said, there is no single line that for Whitman better captures what he's about in Song of Myself especially than that. But can I throw this idea at you and let me try and help you flesh this out? You guys remember when we did our study of Homer's Iliad and of Virgil's Aeneid, and we talked about the importance of the listing. Think about, for example, Homer's Iliad and especially Book 2. I mean, I just want to go back because it seems to me that Whitman knows exactly what he's doing. He wants to subsume the epic tradition in a modern, for him, modern way. In other words, he wants to somehow become the great integral thinker. And this integrating or this integral thinker we're going to hear about in Song of Myself, passage 22. He says, I am integral with you, I too am one phase of all phases. And we're going to see that when we study passage 22 in more detail. But do you remember this set of lines from Iliad 2? Now, again, we always work with the Fagel's translation when we're studying. I've given full lectures at learnstrong.net over all of the books of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and so we're now just coming back to revisit. How about this one from passage book 2, passage starting in 573 and following? Sing to me now, you muses. I have to believe that these lines were in Whitman's mind as he was beginning Leaves of Grass, and especially Song of Myself. Think about what happens in Song of Myself that's very similar to what happens in the Iliad. First, in Book 1, we have a certain kind of contest, linguistic conversation back and forth. Then what happens in the second book? Well, Fagles even calls it the Great Gathering of Armies. And that great gathering ends, for book 2 of Iliad, with an amazing list of all of the different armies that are going to show up. Notice how all of that is set up. Sing to me now, you muses who hold the halls of Olympus. By the way, there's an exclamation point for the Fagles translation. You are goddesses, you're everywhere, you know all things. All we hear is the distant ring of glory. We know nothing. Who were the captains of Achaia? Who were the kings, the mass of troops? I could never tally, never name, not even if I had 10 tongues and 10 mouths, a tireless voice, and the heart inside me bronze. Never unless you muses of Olympus, daughters of Zeus, whose shield, it's interesting the word shield gets used here, as we'll talk about later. Shield is rolling thunder. Sing, sing in memory all who gathered under Troy. Now I can only tell the lords of the ships in all their numbers, exclamation point again. Now I think that what we have going on here in a section that's often maligned. I mean, really? Are you serious with me? What's going on? Over 45 times at the beginning of lines, we will have the word thee. Now, the anaphoria is self-evident, but I mean, come on, it's so unbelievably repetitive. And how about this? We have, and you'll do your own count, we have over 50 different types of situations scenes to be played for us. It's almost as if we're in this amazing kind of old-fashioned slideshow or a PowerPoint presentation where the question is, what's America? Let me show it to you. And it's just one image after another image after another image. We're going to go through them here in a second. But I'm trying to set you up. I mean, if you go back and look at what we had to say about Iliad 2, you'll remember that I said that this is one of the more misunderstood sections of the Iliad. I think it's an important section of the Iliad because it shows us the mass of humanity. It shows us en masse, to use a term that Whitman will love. Now, we're also going to see in this passage some of Whitman's Quaker roots. Elias Hicks, we've commented on that radical Quaker, had an influence, there's no question, on Whitman. And as we now turn to these lines, we're going to pay attention as well to some missing lines. That is to say, the 1855 edition actually had some lines that didn't end up in the deathbed edition, and I think they're important. I think we should pay attention to them, so that way we're ready to go to work with it. Okay. Now, as we turn to our study here, we want to first of all realize that this is a long section, so I'm not going to be able to play the game that I would like to play with you, where I read it all and then come back to exegete. Instead, I'm just going to play around now, line by line or scene by scene. Hey, check this out. There's so many ways to read this. And even though I'm not going to do this, I recommend that you do this. My assumption, again, is that you guys are already working with your own edition, your own annotations, and now you're just using me to kind of help you to see this in different ways. One way to do this is to just draw a line down a piece of paper, and on the left-hand side put male, and on the right-hand side put female. And then just notice how many of these scenes will constitute a masculine or a male scene versus a feminine or a female scene. We'll begin with going back to one of the inscriptions poem Concerti and Whitman's passion and love for music. The pure contralto sings in the organ loft. And you'll remember what we said when we did to a certain Concerti about the idea that opera and music was central to the writing of Leaves of Grass. The carpenter dresses his plank. This is fun stuff for two reasons. One, Whitman and his father were carpenters, so he knew carpentry well. Notice as well the interesting, almost sexual language, and we're just talking about working with wood. The carpenter dresses his plank. The tongue, we immediately obviously think of the use of the word tongue in passage 5. The tongue of his foreplane whistles its wild ascending lisp. Whitman loves to play these kind of games. I think Leaves of Grass is fun. We've mentioned the idea of the game. I think he's having fun through and through. That's not to say he's not serious, but I think he's having a lot of fun when he plays around with this and he ends this line with a somewhat sexual word lisp and all of that. The married and married children ride home to their Thanksgiving dinner. This is a strange line after a carpenter line, so you'll notice how it's very inclusive the way he's playing this. Whitman's eye is ubiquitous, no question. The pilot seizes the kingpin. Now here we're back to pilot as in on a boat, right? By the way, this kingpin was an extended spole of the pilot wheel, so that way you could work against strong currents. He heaves down with strong arm. Notice the echoes. We've heard this before, that strength of the arm. The mate stands braced in the whaleboat. Lance and harpoon are ready. Consider that Melville will publish Moby Dick in 1851. So obviously by 1855, these are resonances that will be for a lot of Whitman's readers kind of like, oh yeah, I know all about that. The duck shooter walks by, silent and cautious stretches. Notice all the S sounds there, by the way. And of course, Whitman always loving to emphasize the idea that some people go out and get their own food for themselves. It's somewhat of a shock to remind readers of today of Leaves of Grass. There is no Walmart in 1855. No. Most of the time, if you're going to eat game or meat, you're going to somehow appropriate it, either through a marketplace where you're going to watch it slaughtered, or you're going to go out and get it yourself. Notice he continues now with some referencing to religion. Remember what we said in our study of, starting from Pomanog, passage 10, that Whitman reduces Leaves of Grass down to three essentials, as he calls them: love, democracy, and the greatness of religion. Here, we're going to, in this poem, obviously, we're going to see all three. The deacons are ordained with crossed hands at the altar. His eye is phenomenal. Just the little things that he sees. The spinning girl retreats and advances. Think about the action of waves. To the hum of the big wheel. Can't help but think of Tennyson's Lady of Shalott in a moment like this as well. The farmer stops by the bars as he walks on a first day loaf and looks at the oats and rye. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. Notice we're on Sunday, right? And first day is the Quaker rendering of Sunday, right? And notice he stops by the bars and he will loaf, a term we're familiar with from passage 1, and he looks at the oats and the rye. Now I've had some students who have read this line and said, you mean he stops by the bar as in to have a little bits of oats and rye, that is to say a little bit of a drink on Sunday? Is that what we mean? Whitman probably doesn't mean that, although it's altogether possible that that could be read with a certain kind of look askance, maybe. Of course, bars here just simply means the bar of the road and the bar of the field, right? And then a really interesting and we will say tragic set of lines, because Whitman had a brother, an oldest brother named Jesse, who ultimately, Whitman himself, had to actually admit to Kings County Lunatic Asylum, 5th of December 1864. And here he's going to almost, predict some of this. The lunatic is carried at last to the asylum, a confirmed case. He will never, and this by the way is in parentheses in the deathbed edition, not in parentheses 1855, but he will never sleep anymore as he did in the cot in his mother's bedroom. It's interesting that Whitman had to fight his mother and argue with her about Jesse. And it was finally when Jesse picked up a chair to strike his own mother that they had to make the decision that he needed probably to go to the asylum. And yet we know this had to have been a serious tragedy in the life of Whitman. Whitman is person, of course. The jour painter, the journeyman printer, and of course this printer it immediately makes us think about Whitman in his early professional work as a journalist. With gray head and jaunt jaws, works at his case. Notice all these G and J sounds, and so it's brilliant. And as well, notice it seems to suggest that the printing business is a tough business. Of course, go back to our Harvard Classics lectures, especially on Ben Franklin, and it will remind you of the fact that Franklin himself started out this way, and many have made that kind of distance between Franklin and Whitman in this way, right? Both of them very, very influential in American thought. And to continue now, the printer turns his quid of tobacco while his eyes blur with the manuscript. It's a difficult project. In other words, Whitman knew what it was to typeset. He did much of his own printing of several editions of Leaves of Grass early on, so he knows the hard work that's involved. The next image is a disturbing one because Whitman saw this in his own life during the time that he was in the Civil War hospitals. The malformed limbs are tied to the surgeon's table. The original 55 was the atomist's table, and he's changed it to surgeon's table. What is removed drops horribly in a pail. Now, this is one of those examples where we go from the lunatic going to the asylum, to the printer working hard, to all of a sudden an amputation, and whatever it is that's cut off is dropped horribly in a pail, in a bucket. And it is the genius of Whitman that he can throw an image like this at you, and this image doesn't go away so quickly. For those of you maybe have seen a film like Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves, in that opening scene where it's possible the leg is going to be extracted, and of course you can see the amputees in a mound. We're going to get to this when we come to drum taps, by the way, so put it in your notes to be looking for it. We then will turn to some of the experiences that Whitman had in and around the culture of slavery. And again, our discussion of Whitman as, is he a racist, is he not a racist, takes us back to passages 10 and 13. The quadroon girl is sold at the auction stand. The drunkard nods by the barroom stove. Now, many have had serious problems with the juxtaposition of a young girl being sold on the auction block as a slave, and the fact that you have a drunkard who is nodding off by the barroom stove. I think what Whitman is saying here is that Both of these activities lead to annihilation and tragedy. I think he is making a very subtle point here. And now back to, I hear America singing, the machinist rolls up his sleeves. By the way, that rolling up your sleeves is a powerful image of what, for Whitman and Sandburg as well, in his poem Chicago, what he feels about America. The policeman travels his beat. You'll remember in passage 8, it's the policeman with his star going right into the middle of the crowd. The gatekeeper marks who pass. These are all people who are somehow specialized in their work. The young fellow drives the express wagon, and then an interesting parenthetical, I love him, though I do not know him. Now, Whitman spent quite a bit of time with these young fellows who drove express wagons. Who knows, maybe he's giving some kind of a indirect reference to them. We then will move in the next set of lines, sadly, to Whitman and his Native American racism. But here it's not really, and we commented on this, of course, in starting from Pominock, passage 16, as well as Song of Myself, passage 10. The half-breed straps on his light boots to compete in the race. Now, this is interesting, because what he's going to say is that we have a young man who is, of course, a half-breed in the same way that we had quadroon earlier. We have a young native individual who is about to go on a race. And again, I pointed out Whitman's use of the word race as contest and, of course, game we mentioned as well. Pay attention to it, and to the way that Whitman will applaud the whole notion of athletics, from whether it be racing as in running to baseball. We'll get to some of those lines. And then we get another image, and this one takes us out west. The western turkey shooting draws old and young. I say out west, that is to say to the rural. It doesn't necessarily have to be out west. But he calls it the western turkey shooting draws old and young. And then an image that we saw in passage 10 of Song of Myself. Some lean on their rifles, some sit on logs. This leaning on your rifle, especially the long rifle, will make more sense now with the next scene. Out from the crowd steps the marksman. One of Whitman's heroes was James Fenimore Cooper and the leather stocking tails and all of that. Takes his position, levels his piece. The groups levels his piece, and so that's the end of that scene. In other words, we've got the marksman, the famous shooting marksman, and there's so many stories in American history of these kinds of marksman special types of things. I mean, Bill Cody in his traveling show that we're familiar with out here in Wyoming emphasized that as well. The marksman, the one who can shoot really well. By the way, in the original 1855, there were conjunctions that were used so that it read the marksman, out from the crowd steps the marksman and takes his position and levels his piece. And he edited these to tighten the line up. Then we move to immigrants. So we're going all over the place. We're back to starting from Pominock passage 18 and his comments about immigrants there. The groups of newly come immigrants cover the war for Levy. In other words, we've got all kinds of new people coming into America. Then we've got another racist scene, and this one is again with slavery. As the woolly pates hoe in the sugar field, the overseer views them from his saddle. Now, I just want to point out, because of our study and our love in 303 of the great Frederick Douglass, remember that he wrote 3 autobiographies. The first narrative of 1845, think about this is the 1855 Song of Myself. Then, of course, Bondage and Freedom of, 1855. So in the same year that this set of lines is published, you're going to have Frederick Douglass publishing his second autobiography, and then finally his Life and Times of 1881. And of course, Leaves of Grass is 1892 for the deathbed edition. So it's a very interesting thing, the way that this set of lines is going to get read, and obviously it's a disturbing set of lines as well. The bugle calls in the ballroom, and all of a sudden we go from a slavery image to dancing. So you can see how Whitman is moving back and forth. The bugle calls in the ballroom, and the gentlemen run for their partners, the dancers bow to each other. We have pointed out the ways in which dancing is one of the powerful motifs of reading Leaves of Grass, right? So, I mean, it's an interesting way that he juxtaposes all these different images. And then he gives us one that might have something to do with the previous scene, or maybe not. The youth lies awake in the cedared roof garret and harks to the musical rain. Now, this is an interesting juxtaposition. A young person sitting up in the top of a house listening to the rain falling, right? And then we're going to go to the Wolverine, a native of Michigan, sets traps on the creek that helps fill the Huron. We're back to the Huron and starting from Paumanok Passage 16. And more, of course, referencing to native or indigenous peoples. You'll remember what we said in Song of Myself, Passage 10. Here, we've got the squaw. But I want to point out that in the original version, we have a set of lines that are now edited out that sounds like this. The reformer ascends the platform. He spouts with his mouth and nose. The company returns from its excursion. The darky, racist language, the darky brings up the rear and bears the well-riddled target. Now, this is interesting that this set of lines would be excised. I'll let you decide why you think maybe Whitman would take these away. And then the next set of lines begins with the squaw, wrapped in her yellow hemmed cloth, is offering moccasins and bead bags for sale. Again, we've commented already when we dealt with Passage 10 and starting from Paumanok Passage 16. The connoisseur, or the expert obviously as it relates to taste, peers along the exhibition gallery with half-shut eyes bent sideways. I love the way that Whitman loves to use this notion and this word picture of bending. We saw this, of course, in Passage 4-5 in more sexual ways. Notice here it's not clear whether Whitman is celebrating the connoisseur or saying about him, or her, they're really not as expert as they think that they are. We'll remember that in inscriptions several times, Whitman spoke directly to those elitists and he didn't have much time for them. As the deckhands make fast the steamboat, now remember that Whitman saw this because he went to New Orleans